Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Sanibel Public Library. My name is Duane Shaffer. I'm head of collection development for the library and your host for these World War II programs. Before we begin, I really need to give you an apology about January 20th. I don't know how many of you showed up, but the library was shut down for health and safety reasons, and I really apologize for that. We are rescheduling Big Week. Big Week is now going to be on April 1st, if you want to tune in for that. These programs, however, they're going to be virtual for the time being, and we will hope for the future that we can do some in-person programmings later. Those program notes that I want to give you on Friday, the 25th of this month, we will be doing the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which was the last large carrier battle of the Second World War. On March 11th, we will be doing Operation Griffin. Some of you may not be familiar with Operation Griffin, otherwise it's known as Operation Greif. It is the operation where the Germans launched a secret campaign using American and English-speaking German soldiers, and they were dropped behind Allied lines to sow confusion. And lastly, as I said, on April 1st, we will be doing Big Week. Actually, I wanted to do Big Week in order because some of what we're going to talk about today has a little bit to do with that, but we will certainly get with that later. A couple library notes. Geez, if you don't have a library card yet, please come on down and sign up with us, because we do have a whole bunch of really, really great World War II books, and there you're going to find those in 940.54. We also have a great display with a lot of models that of tanks, airplanes, and equipment that you would have seen in 1944 in these various operations. This right here, this is a Cromwell tank, and actually it was one of the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats. Let's see, one other thing, the pop quiz. Yes, we will still have a pop quiz embedded somewhere in this presentation. Now, I know this is going to be difficult because we're not going to be able to tell which one of you will answer the question correctly. So it's going to be on the honor system. So if you answer the question correctly, that's great. Next time you come down to the library, hey, I'll give you a book. So that's fine. I want to offer my thanks today for our producer of the day. Beth, please stand up. No, put your face in here so everybody can see you. There she is. Hi, Beth. Thank you. Oh, we also have a really great map that I have set up showing the entire Normandy coastline and a lot of the different operations that occurred between June and August 1944. So let's begin. Okay, and can we get rid of some of those that are underneath there? Okay, great, thank you. All right, it is going to be Operation Goodwood. Operation Goodwood was perhaps Britain's greatest tank battle, but we also had a Canadian division that was involved in this too. It occurred between July 18th and July 20th, 1944. Now, to give you a little bit of a background of what was going on up to July 10th, of course, a lot of you are already familiar with this history, but we're going to go over it really, really fast just to bring you up to speed. Of course, we had the Normandy landings on June 6th with the British and Canadians landing at Gold Sword and Juno beaches, and the Americans landing at Omaha and Utah beaches. June 7th, the British captured Bayeux, and on June 9th, the United States captured Saint-Mère-Église. June 12th, the United States and the British link up in Carentan, and at that point, there are 326,000 troops on a 50-mile front. However, the problem, and it's going to be a problem for the program that we're talking about today, nowhere is that line more than 10 miles deep. The British, they're going to try to widen that bridgehead by launching Operation Epsom on the 25th. It opens around Caen. Caen actually was supposed to be taken on D-Day. However, a month later, it is still has not been captured. Operation Epsom ends when the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division show up. Monty launches another operation, Operation Carnwood. It opens around Caen and it also fails. However, why did it fail? Monty was keeping up the pressure on that eastern front of the invasion beachheads. He was drawing off the panzers while the Americans were preparing for Operation Cobra, which we will talk a little bit later. Going back and talking about how deep the beachhead was, the reason for that is there's several. There's the disciplined German defense. Of course, the weather was awful on and off that entire month. The terrain, which we'll talk about a little bit, and Allied command issues. Of course, the Allies, they had a lot of different concerns. They had a lot of different personalities. The invasion had bogged down, and the stalemate was causing a lot of anger and frustration in America and Britain and in Russia. Stalin was accusing everyone of dragging their feet because he wanted the second front to open. And everyone had breakout fever. Now, what was breakout fever? Breakout fever was they wanted to get out of that stalemate. They wanted to break out into that open country south of Saint-Mère-Église and go on to Paris, which was about 100 miles to the east. Everyone had breakout fever. So what was going to be done about that? Well, this shows you a little bit of a map around D-Day plus 30. And as you can see, not a lot of ground had been taken. Of course, we have Caen, which is going to be the focal point of our presentation today. You can see how uneven that front is. Of course, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, they were in the left-hand side of your screen, and they were putting up a very determined resistance. Of course, it was very quickly becoming a battle of attrition, where there was a lot of casualties on each side. Here's a cartoon that appeared. Of course, it shows Hitler's frustration because he did not know when or where the invasion was going to occur. And of course, there was the dummy army that was up in Scotland. Of course, I know many of you have probably seen some of these pictures. Of course, a lot of those were in that army up there, and to fool the Germans, if they were doing any kind of aerial reconnaissance, it looked like there indeed was an army. And of course, the Germans, hey, they were thinking the invasion was going to come at the Pas de Calais. Why? Because the Pas de Calais is the shortest distance from England. They were never thinking, although there were several generals that were thinking, perhaps Normandy. The majority of them were thinking most likely the Pas de Calais. And this was going to be the attitude almost 2 months after the Normandy landings. So we're going to talk about the command problems in the West. Gerd von Rundstedt, he was in charge of Army Group West. He's the guy up there on the right-hand side. After the Normandy invasion occurred, he became very unhappy with the way things were going. Of course, he and Rommel, who was down in the bottom part of your screen, they were always at odds on how to deal with the Allied invasion. Rommel, he wanted to meet the invasion on the beach before it could take hold, and he wanted to throw them back into the sea. Rundstedt, he wanted to keep a mobile reserve well behind that line and wait for the Allies to come in and then crush them there. He became very upset and very unhappy when they miscalculated how quickly the Allied divisions could land. And he told Hitler to end the war as quickly as possible. So my Kampfführer canned him, gave him the axe. Now, see, the problem also is that there was this bubbling plot beneath the surface with a lot of the German generals. They were thinking that if they could get rid of Hitler, they could negotiate with the West and put a stop to the war in the West and better able to meet the Soviet onslaught in the east. Well, that was a pipe dream because at the Casablanca Conference in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin already said unconditional surrender. There's going to be no negotiation. There's going to be no kind of nonsense that happened at the end of the First World War. So we have Hitler on the left. Of course, he wants to hold the panzers back because he is absolutely convinced that the Allied invasion is going to still land at the Pas-de-Calais, even though they're landing division after division after division at Normandy. And of course, as we know, July 20th will be an eventful day for him. And why is that? Because that is the day that several German conspirators, they place a bomb under his table in his headquarters. It explodes. He is wounded but not killed. Also, underneath we see Bagration. Well, what's Bagration? Bagration was the Soviet offensive at that almost exact same time, was going to make the Normandy invasion look like a kindergarten display. And what I mean by that is that the Soviets crushed Army Group Center, taking and killing almost 300,000 German soldiers. Of course, this and Goodwood happened at the same time. And we get to Rommel, who was in the middle of the screen there. On July 17th, even before Operation Goodwood began, Rommel is inspecting troops in the southeast of Caen when he is attacked by J-bows. Now, what are J-bows? This is the short German abbreviation for Yacht bombers. And in this case, they weren't necessarily fighter bombers. There were two Spitfires that came out of nowhere, shot up his command car. Rommel is seriously injured. He is listed as being mortally wounded, but he does recover. However, because of his knowledge and possible involvement in the plot to kill Hitler, Hitler decides to give him the option to commit suicide, and this he does. Okay, here's our orientation map. This is more of a modern map you see of Caen. All of the action is going to occur for Goodwood. It's going to occur just a little bit to the east and southeast of Caen. And as you see, that road going to the south, N158, that is the road to Falaise. And that is going to also come into play here in a few minutes. Okay, again, what was happening? The invasion had bogged down, and the British, by this time, they've been fighting the war since 1939, and there were a lot of casualties in North Africa and in Italy. And they were becoming very conscious of their casualties. And they were worried that the whole invasion being bogged down the way it was rapidly approaching World War I levels. The Bocage country was accounting for massive casualty lists on both sides. Those of you who do not know what the Bocage country is, this is the area where the Americans were mostly fighting, and the Bocage were these huge mounds of hedges, sometimes 10 to 12 feet high on top of earthen mounds. It was a dream for a defensive army, not so much for an offensive army. And as we already indicated, the 12th SS was there, but they were nearly completely wasted and they were withdrawn. The 7th Army, which is in that area also, they are nearly to the breaking point to contain the bridgehead. The Allies are getting very, very nervous because all of a sudden these rockets come out of nowhere and starting to fall on London, killing lots of people, and they are worried that they need to break out of the bridgehead. So what are we going to do? General Miles Dempsey, he had an idea for a breakout, so he brought the plan to Montgomery for a breakout southeast of Caen. Then they would go down to Falaise, wheel east, and Paris would then be within their reach. Again, it's 100 miles away. That's a lot of country. Montgomery's orders would change, and they were controversial a bit then, and certainly now. And I am not going to advocate one way or another on Montgomery because they have camps on both sides, the pros and cons of his strategies. Eisenhower, of course, was very encouraging to Montgomery, and he sent him a letter in where he said, "I am viewing the prospects with the most tremendous optimism and enthusiasm. I would not be surprised to see you gain a great victory." Well, Montgomery, he really has no respect for Eisenhower. He feels Eisenhower does not have a grasp for the situation in Normandy. And but what you will see is that even after this is over, of course, when the Americans and the British are then going east through France and liberating Paris, everyone is willing to let bygones be bygones, and all of their differences are going to be mostly forgotten. However, the plan that Dempsey brings, because the Allies have such a large preponderance of armor, the Americans had 8-1 advantage over the Germans. The British had 4-1. So they have all of this armor that they're going to use. They're going to have an attack that is going to thrust southeast of Caen. But however, Monty's plan is going to fall apart at the start line. Sorry. We're going to take a quick look at the German commanders. On the left, we have Hans von Klug. The German word Klug also means clever or cunning. Klug is the guy who takes over for von Rundstedt when von Rundstedt throws in the towel, says he doesn't want to have anything else to do with things. Klug comes in, he immediately starts fighting with Rommel, chiding Rommel for not being aggressive enough. And Rommel says, wait till you see what's going on here. You won't be so ready for all of that. And then eventually Klug does come around. He sees that the situation is pretty hopeless, and he sends a letter off to the high command where he says there's no way in which we can find a strategy which can counterbalance the destructive effect of the enemy's dominance of the sky. And that's why I wanted to do Big Week first, because that had a lot to do with it. The Allied dominance of the sky is going to be an overarching concern all over the place. And he says, without that, with that dominance, we can't do a thing on the battlefield. The guy on the top is Sepp Dietrich. He is in charge of the SS Panzer divisions. He had his ear to the ground. And what I mean by that is he learned a trick when he was in Russia, where if you put your ear to the ground, you could hear vibrations and rumblings in a certain direction. This is how he knew that the British and Canadian armor was being marshaled for an attack. They knew it was going to come, but they weren't sure. They weren't sure if the thrust was going to be mainly from the Canadians on the southwest or through the south of Caen or around from the southeast on the British airborne bridgehead. The guy on the right, Heinrich Eberbach, he was in command of Panzer Group West, all of the tanks. This guy, you can see he had his nose shot off in the First World War, but he was also very cognizant of what was against them. So the bombardment is going to begin at 5:30 on July the 18th. This is going to cause incredible havoc. There's something like 800 bombers, mixed bombers, Lancasters, B-17s, B-24s, and they are going to lay a carpet out in front of the tanks and just destroy everything in their path. However, this is what Caen looked like after that bombardment. This was all that was left of the bombardment on the 7th. Most of the civilians had left by that time, but 800 people still arrived. The British soldiers that were able to take part of Caen said that Caen wasn't as much liberated as it was obliterated. And this is what it looked like after the bombardment. Here's some wrecked German tanks. Now it's interesting to see that the tank on the right is a Tiger tank. A Tiger tank weighs about 45 tons. This gives you some idea of the incredible force of the bombardment. There were several thousand tons laid out in front of the Allied advance. That's a Panther on the left that was kind of knocked on its side. Several German accounts after this said that if soldiers were not blown to pieces and vaporized, many of them just went crazy and started running towards the Allied lines. There were even several that had committed suicide after this. However, the bombardment was not complete. This is what Cagney looked like after the bombardment. It kind of looks like a moonscape almost. But again, the bombardment was not complete, and a lot of the German defenses weren't even touched. However, all the way in the front, the first units that the British are going to encounter is the 116th Air Landing Division. This was a very weak Luftwaffe division that was cannibalized from a lot of different units, and they were put in the front, and they are absolutely almost totally wiped out. However, fresh units were on either side of that flank of that bombardment. They are going to come in and be ready for the British when they come. So here's a great picture I had to throw in. It doesn't have anything to do with this talk. Is this a bunch of workers in a hayfield? That's what you would think if you were just looking at it. However, it is a brigade of Churchill heavy tanks that are in deep camouflage. However, they really didn't have to waste much time on this because the Allies, of course, they had air dominance. They had something like 12,000 aircraft in the area. The Germans had about 100, but still there was the chance that they might show up sometime. Here are our commanders. The 8th Corps Commander, Richard O'Connor. Interesting guy. He is captured in the North African campaign and spends a lot of time in a German prison camp, an Italian prison camp. He then escapes from Italy and is able to come back. He's got something to prove. He wants a victory very, very badly. So he's going to have the bulk of the British troops under his command. And General Crocker on the right, he's in the 1st Corps. They're going to be on the left flank of the attack. The Canadian General Guy Simmons, he's the head of the 2nd Canadian Corps. He's very, very wary of this plan because he has seen how Operation Epsom ended up, how Operation Charnwood ended up, because many of his troops became casualties. And they weren't sure about this plan of Monty's. They weren't sure whether it was going to be an actual breakout and they were going to punch through and go all the way to Falaise, or whether it was going to be a limited demonstration to draw off the German panzers. Here are the commanders of the 3 divisions that are going to lead the attack. This guy on the left, Pip Roberts of the 11th Armored Division, he's a real hot pants. He's a firecracker. He is a 37-year-old general who has a lot of armor experience. He didn't like O'Connor's plan because O'Connor's plan did the same thing it did in Operation Epsom. It separated the armor from the infantry, and he didn't like that because he had the experience of knowing that armor and infantry had to work in tandem, if not completely with the artillery as well. He's going to be in charge of the 11th Armored Division. General George Erskine, he's going to be in charge of the 7th Armored Division, one of those, the tank that you see behind me there. They're the famous Desert Rats, and they are the guys that fought in North Africa against Rommel and the Afrika Korps. The guy in the upper right, General Adair, he's going to be head of the Guards Armored Division. They're going to be all the way over on the east flank of the attack. This was going to be their first battle. And the Brits, they are pretty well aware of what is going to happen because they have not counted out the German soldiers, because they've encountered them on too many occasions where they had underestimated them and paid a very high price afterwards. This is our centerpiece. This is our map, okay? You're going to see Caen right in the sort of to the left there. The 2nd Canadian Division is going to punch down on the left-hand side. That would be the right flank of the attack if you're facing south. The main effort is going to be the 11th Armored, the 7th Armored, and the Guards Armored Division. The 3rd Division of the British 1st Corps is going to punch down to the east. They're going to encounter the 21st Panzer Division in a very, very important town. As you can see, right in the center there is Cagny. We will talk about Cagny in a few minutes. But that shows you as far as they got. And I don't want to end the story prematurely, but if you can see the legend of miles and kilometers there, the entire attack only made about 7 miles before it was stopped. And a big reason for that is that we see the Bourguébus Ridge. That is the high ground. And all of that area where you see those black arrows going down, that is all wide open country. And you can see what is developing here. As I said, Monty's plan, O'Connor's plan is going to be armor going out in the open and with very little cover and a very large high ground ridge in front of them. The other problem is there's a lot of little towns and villages to the left and right flank where the Germans are very deeply entrenched. Here's a cool picture of a couple of Shermans and a Sherman Firefly. What's the difference? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. They're carrying infantry, waiting for the order to advance. The operation for the Brits was known as, of course, Goodwood. For the Canadians, it was called the Atlantic. Now, that's that Sherman you see on the left. It has a 75 millimeter gun. And the Firefly, which is 2 down from there, it will have either a 76 millimeter gun or what the Brits call a 12 pounder, which is a more powerful gun than a 75. Here's some Cromwell tanks crossing over the bridge. They had to throw these bridges across the Orne River because many of them had been destroyed by the Germans as they were retreating. Again, moving 3 armored divisions makes a lot of noise. And of course, even after the bombardment ended, and there was too big of a gap between when the bombardment ended and when the tanks started crossing the bridge going into the attack, this gave the Germans a chance to recover and prepare their positions. Here's a good map of Caen. You see the different lines. It shows Operation Epsom, Charnwood, and Goodwood. You see how far south Goodwood made it. That is the dark green line that goes just short of the Bourguébus Ridge, because that is where the 1st SS Panzer Division was located, and a lot of anti-tank guns. They were looking straight down into this open valley. All these tanks are coming across, and they are going to become sitting ducks, a target. The Germans, they had 5 lines of defense that they had set up. Now, another problem is that when the British tanks started going out, they had to go through a very, very narrow route to go to the south, because just before that, when the British and the Allies had taken that ground, they had sown many, many minefields, and unfortunately, they had not marked them. So they had to spend a lot of time clearing a narrow pathway so the armor could get through. The Germans, they had the lines that I told you about. They had tanks, self-propelled guns, anti-tank guns, and of course, that final line of defense up on that ridge was the SS Panzer Division. Those of you who know a little bit about the composition of the German army knows that you had the Wehrmacht, those were the regular soldiers, and you had the SS. Those were the hardcore fanatic soldiers that got all the best equipment, all the best guns, food, and everything, and they were fierce fighters. Up until, I want to say, maybe about 1942 or so, there were very, very strict requirements to be an SS soldier. You had to be at least 6 foot tall and, of course, be a fanatical Nazi. Now, what you see on the left, you see the Colombelle factory area. This was a steel mill right on the edge of Caen that the Germans had, and they defended it tenaciously because it was a perfect point that they could get up into those higher areas in the chimneys, and they sent their artillery observers up there, and they could see every move that the British were making from the moment they went across those bridges. Here's a more of a tactical map. You can see, I actually like the other map better, but I threw this one in here so you can see those red lines. going across all of that open country. You can see all that brown area right in there. That is all open. And of course, you see the Bourguébus Ridge right there, where you had the 1st SS Panzer Corps. You had elements of the 9th and 10th still there before they would be sent up to Holland after this battle. Here is a King Tiger. This was the 70-ton monster that the Germans had. Actually, they had very few at this battle, but it was part of the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion. Again, only a handful of these, but it had a high velocity 88 millimeter gun. And it was almost impossible to stop by anything that the British or Canadians had on the battlefield. Here's our pop quiz. Beth, would you like to participate? What is this? And what is it used for? I'll give you sort of like a Jeopardy thing of 10 seconds to think about this, okay? Take a good look at this picture. I know some of you already know, but what is this and what? Of course, it's a Sherman tank, but what is it used for? What's that thing? What's that thing on the front of the tank? Well, because they were operating in the hedgerows, they were operating in the bocage, they needed something to bite through those heavy hedges. So this was a Sherman Rhino, and it was used to make paths through the dense bocage country in Normandy. Because, as I said before, they were taking a huge number of casualties with all of the German defensive lines in there. Okay, so if you got that, I trust you, you got it right. So the next time you come to the library, see me and get a book, okay? Ah, look at this. This is splashing across your screen. As much as the armor was important in this battle on both sides, it was this gun right here that was going to take the greatest number of casualties of the British tanks. It is mostly used as an anti-aircraft gun, the 88 millimeter, but the Germans quickly found out that they could use this in direct fire to knock out Allied tanks. One hit from this anywhere on your tank and you were doomed. Okay, here's a picture of it in operation. And I found out from one of my sources, which I'll show you at the end, there were 78 88 millimeter guns of these type in front of and on the flanks of the advancing British armor and the Canadian armor. They hid these behind haystacks. They hid these in the middle villages on the edges. They had them camouflaged. And as that British and Canadian armor were going south, they were just chopping huge chunks in their lines. And as I said, the armor, mostly okay on the front, but the side and rear armor, it was like paper. They could just punch right through it. And many were knocked out by the bombardment, but again, there were still plenty of those to take a huge toll on the advancing British and Canadians. This guy right here, now this is almost an apocryphal story, but I did hear a video where he said this actually did happen. Actually heard also the General Pip Roberts on the other side. He said it happened. This is Colonel Hans Luck of the 21st Panzer. He was coming back from a wedding just before this battle, and he was rushing to the battlefield. And in the area of Cagny, he found a battery of 4 of those 88 millimeters that I showed you. And they were busy shooting down any of the Allied planes that might have been in the area. There were actually a few after the bombardment because the air coordinator was killed in the British Army almost right as the offensive was beginning. He found these 488s and he said, you're going to start engaging these tanks that you see out there in the open field and in the wheat. And they said, no, 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 we are Luftwaffe. We're not doing that. And he says, no, you're going to do it. He pulls out his pistol and he aims it right at the officer. He says, lower those barrels, shoot those tanks. And they started engaging the Shermans and the Cromwells. And almost instantly, they knocked out 20 of those tanks. And the Brits, they said they couldn't even hear the shells coming, but they could see the shell coming through the tall wheat. And he said they were like torpedoes coming towards us. Here's another weapon we're going to just take a short period of time with. This is the Panzerfaust, and this was the precursor of the modern day rocket-propelled grenade. It was very easy to use. It was a throwaway. It was a hollow charge. and it could destroy just about any of the tanks that the Allies had. And I have deadly in the bocage because a tank could be going down one aisle with bocage on both sides. The German could pop up and just go boom like that and get you in the side and blow you up. And the guy on the lower end, that's the Panzerschreck. That's basically a bazooka. They didn't have as many of those, but they had a whole ton of those Panzerfausts. Again, here is some German anti-tank guns, the 75 millimeter. These are the real stars of this battle. Again, I don't want to take away anything from the tank men, but these are the real stars because these are the guys that were in those prepared hidden positions along the flanks as the British and Canadians went south, and they took a huge toll from those tanks. Here's some Cromwells advancing in open country, not necessarily a success during Goodwood. And as I said, note the lack of infantry. Without the infantry to protect the tanks became meat as they passed these fortified positions that your Germans had dug in. Here's some equipment we're going to talk about. Again, this is a talk about military ordnance. This is the British Daimler Mk1 car. Their job was to race ahead of the armor and do a reconnaissance. They were to go to the Bourguébus Ridge and open the road to Falaise. Well, they were only partially successful, and a number of them were knocked out before they even got to the ridge. Here is the nemesis right here that everybody loves to talk about. This is the Tiger tank. It was 45 tons. It had, its main gun was that dreaded 88 millimeter. It had a whole bunch of really thick armor on the front, some on the sides, and it could go 45 miles per hour on the road. I've got an interesting story coming up. I hope I remember to put the slide in. You're going to like it. Here's some British and Canadian tanks that were used. The Cromwell, as I showed you in the front, it had a 75 millimeter gun. Sometimes it might have a 76 millimeter, and it had the Rolls-Royce Meteor V12 petrol. It was a very good tank. I'm going to show you another one that was even better that they had a whole bunch of, but really didn't use that many of. Here's the German self-propelled guns, the Jagdpanzer and Jagdpanther, two different types. One was on the chassis of an M4 on the top, and the other was a Panther chassis on the bottom. These both had 75 millimeter guns. Here's the Sherman Firefly. It could have either a 76 or a 17 pounder. It could hold its own against the Mark IVs, which you'll see in another slide or two, but it really couldn't mix it up with anything bigger. The Sherman was the standard used by the Allies in Normandy. Now you say, well, the Sherman was an American tank. Well, yes, you're right, but we sent a lot of them over, and the British and the Canadians used them. Unfortunately, it didn't have a very good reputation with many of its crews, and they called it the Ronson. Well, any of you that knows what a Ronson is a lighter. And even a slight grazing hit could make the ammunition and gasoline inside explode. After Goodwood to the end of the war, of course, it would be quantity versus quality. The quantity of the Allies, the enormous amount of ordnance that they could throw into the field, versus the quality of those German tanks. However, in the end, that's not going to make any difference for them. Here is the map of the Second British Army. Again, this is a little bit more of a detailed map, but you can see all the way at the bottom of that line, those are the positions that were reached as of July 21st. And there's a very definite limit to this, this attack, this offensive, this operation, as you'll see in the next few slides here. Here's a cute little thing. This is the universal carrier, the Bren gun carrier. This was used quite a bit for reconnaissance and scouting and just general chores for hauling things around. It had many different weapons. It could have the standard Bren gun, which you see in the bottom slide there. And that's why it was called a Bren gun carrier. Here's some advancing on a narrow front. And this was a typical scene. This looks like it might be a posed picture, but there is some action going on there. You see a Sherman right behind there. You see a couple of the Bren gun carriers. And this is the story. This was the King Tiger that I showed you before, and it's the early version. What I mean by that, it had the turret that was designed by the Henschel Company. The ones that we're going to see later, perhaps in the Operation Griffin, will have the Henschel turret. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the push turret. We'll see the Henschel turret later. There were only a handful of these at Goodwood, probably for good reason that they were a very, very deadly tank. Here's the story I want to tell you about. A Sherman of the 2nd Armored Guards after ramming a King Tiger near Canyon. Now the story is the Lieutenant John Gorman of the Irish Guards was motoring along in his tank during the attack. All of a sudden he comes into a field and there's two of these monsters right here and 3 Tiger tanks. Well, what does he do? Because he's so close, he can't slug it out with them. So he decides to ram the first King Tiger. Of course, this jars the crew on the inside of the King Tiger. They all bail out of their hatches and start running. He bails out of his hatch with his crew and they start running. But the difference is he comes back with 3 or 4 Sherman Fireflies and they finish off that King Tiger. Here's the Churchill tank right here. I wanted to tell you about that. This is one of the few heavy tanks that the British had at 40 tons. It could hold its own against most of its German counterparts. And a really, really funny story about this is that when Winston Churchill was brought to look at the first batch of these tanks, and he took one look at it, he says, "It's big, it's ugly, and I can see why they named it after me." This is the workhorse of the German Panzer Army, the Mark IV. It has a 75 millimeter gun. It also has what's on the side. Those are called skirts, or in German, Schürzen. This is how they would stop an incoming round going towards that very vulnerable side armor. Here's a Sherman Firefly advancing through the brush, as you can see. Very, very difficult terrain going through there. Here's one of the weapons that took a big, big toll not only on the Operation Goodwood, but also other places where the Allies encountered them. This was what the Germans called the Nebelwerfer, and it would fire a stream of 81 millimeter shells. You can see the guy on the left, he's holding one of those monstrous things. They load them into those tubes and they pull the cord and they all go flying out there. And the sound that it made as they were coming through made this screeching kind of high-pitched whining sound. So the Americans, Brits, and Canadians called them the Screaming Meanies. This is the Panther. It had big issues when it first started, a problem with engine fires, but its 75 millimeter gun and heavy armor were feared by the Allies. It also had a cross-drive transmission. This is, along with the Soviet T-34, this is actually considered probably one of the best tanks of the entire war. Oh no. It happened. She's still doing this to me. She's coming in here and messing with my slides. It doesn't matter where I'm doing it. So I apologize for that. So we'll move on. Okay. Here is the final part of the Operation Goodwood around July 19th, July 20th. The 7th, look how far the 7th Armor gets, right down there by Hubert-Follet and short of the Bourguébus Ridge. And you see they do get very, very far, but they sort of really start running out of steam on July the 19th into July 20th. They almost make it, but again, they're short. And the 1st SS Panzer, which is there in strength, having been reinforced, they slam the brakes on Monty's operation. Here's a Sherman Firefly crew. They're ferrying some troops along the front. You can see the uneven nature of this terrain. This is all Goodwood terrain. You see all these different forests and trees. And again, it was interspersed with different fortified villages and hamlets. This is what caused the most amount of grief for the advancing British and Canadians. Here's some troops hitching a ride on a Sherman, and this is a Cromwell on the bottom, passing out a knocked out Tiger and a Mark IV. This is one of our last slides. This is tanks operating in the open country. This is actually a painting that was done of the Goodwood operation. Again, it was not to their advantage unless they had mobile infantry. And this is something that Roberts, General Roberts, was very, very aware of. Even before this operation began, he wanted to have the armor and the infantry working together. But he said afterwards, he said, by our third operation, which is going to be Operation Bluecoat, this would be the operation where they would go south finally and engage in a battle, what was known as the Falaise Gap. I said, it took us that long to finally convince everybody and to get that offensive correct. Okay, here's our cost in the aftermath. The Allies, by the time they did get all the way down there, the Canadians made it all the way down there. Canadians lost 1,965 men. Of that 1,965 men of the South Saskatchewans lost 250 men in the attack. The Essex Scots of that same area, they lost about 200 men. The British lost 5,500 men. The tanks, they lost 400 tanks in this attack. Again, it was almost all due to the Germans having those anti-tank assets along the flanks of the attack. They lost 36%. But here's the good news for them, because they were advancing and the Germans were doing their phased withdrawal. Many of their tanks were recovered and repaired. The Germans, they had about the same number of casualties. Most were actually from the bombardment, but they also were able to capture 2,000 prisoners. The Germans lost about 75 to 100 tanks. Again, about 40 of those were lost in the bombardment. My final word on that is that the tactical victory is going to go to the Germans because they inflicted such a heavy, heavy cost on the Allies. The Allies advanced, they were stopped at 7 miles, again, just short of that Bourguébus Ridge. However, then the strategic victory goes to the Allies because the Allies did not give up ground. The Germans did. The Allies' losses, they were easily replaced. Those tanks that they lost, there were huge tank parks up in the Normandy area, huge tank parks that were able to replace those losses. The Germans, however, they were not getting any replacements. The Germans lost about 116,000 men or so during the first phases of the Normandy operation. They only received about 1,000 replacements. So again, after Goodwood was the American Operation Cobra, which began on the 24th. The end of Goodwood actually was almost like a hurt because on July 20th, the skies opened up and there were torrential rains. Everything became a sea of mud being churned up by these giant tanks and equipment, and the operation did come to an end. The operation on August the 7th, that lasted till the 14th, was the German Operation Lüttich, and it was in the area of Mortain. And that was Hitler's attempt to regain ground, which was absolutely destroyed because of the Allied air superiority. There were clear skies the whole time, and the American and British Air Force came in and just absolutely chopped the Germans to pieces. The Falaise Gap, that was August 12th and 21st. This is where a huge number of German tanks and infantry and other assets were trapped in this giant pocket. But because they couldn't close that gap quickly enough, many of those German divisions and the armor and artillery, they escaped to the east. Of course, we had the introduction of George Patton on August 1st with his Third Army, and he then was able to wheel to the south and then to the east. And of course, we know his story of gaining an incredible amount of territory in a short time. Paris was liberated on August the 19th through the 25th. Now we're going to get down to Montgomery's controversy. Again, I'm not going to take one side or another, but Montgomery's operational orders, when he first issued them, said that Falaise was going to be the objective of Goodwood. You were going to go down there, punch through, and go all the way down the Falaise Road and take Falaise. Was it intended to be a breakout or not? Well, there's people who then said that whatever happened in the end, Montgomery is going to say that it is exactly what he intended. Well, of course, afterwards, because the operation was halted, there's a lot of anger. Churchill comes and he meets with Montgomery. Montgomery is begging him for his job and somehow convinces Churchill not to fire him, which was actually probably a good thing because Montgomery was extremely, extremely popular with the British, and had Churchill sacked him, it would have been very, very bad for their morale. But anyway, Monty stays on, and afterwards we see Operation Market Garden, which was the airborne and ground operation into Holland. We also know that the movie A Bridge Too Far was made about that particular operation. Then we have the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, which is December the 16th, 1944. And during that is what we're going to talk about in Operation Greif and Griffin. So I'm going to share this with you right here. I put this in here because my wife told me that I should probably add some lists of recommended reading for all of you. We have some of these in the library if you would like to come down and see. Otherwise, we could probably get them for you through interlibrary loan. Of course, Rick Atkinson's wonderful trilogy on World War II. The one concerning this operation was Guns at Last Light. We also have two by Ian Dalglish, Operation Goodwood and Goodwood, the British Offensive. Germans in Normandy by Richard Hargreaves, very, very good book, in-depth study of that subject. Operation Overlord by Max Hastings, one of my all-time favorite authors. He has written many, many histories, and this one was very, very pivotal in my preparation for this talk. Second World War by John Keegan, more of a general story of the Second World War, but it did have a good section on this. The German 88 in Combat by Janusz Piekalkowicz. I did that. Okay, so next time, and we'll see you next time, we're going to talk about the Battle of Philippine Sea, again, which was the final large carrier battle of the Second World War. I want you to all have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.